The wind carved its name into every wooden board of our one-room schoolhouse that morning, and I knew something was different about the silence that followed. I was Miss Eleanor Hartwell, 23 years old and foolish enough to believe I could tame the wilderness children of Anchorage with nothing but chalk dust and determination. The temperature had dropped to 30 below, and the frost on the windows was so thick it turned the world outside into a blur of white and shadow. My students sat huddled around the pot-bellied stove, their breath creating small clouds that danced in the dim light filtering through the ice-covered glass. Their faces were red from the cold, their mittens hanging from strings around their necks, and their eyes held that familiar mixture of restlessness and resignation that came with another brutal Alaskan winter. I had no idea that this particular morning would haunt me for the rest of my life, that the simple act I was about to perform would unlock secrets buried deeper than any grave in the frozen ground. Something told me to capture this moment, to preserve what I thought was just another ordinary day. But what I couldn't see then was that nothing about this day would ever be ordinary. But the real mystery wasn't in what I could see that morning. It was in what I couldn't see, what was hiding in plain sight among my students. The children filed into their seats with the practiced efficiency of those who had learned that survival meant conserving every ounce of warmth and energy. Little Mary Kowalski rubbed her hands together, her fingers still stiff from the walk through the snow, while Tommy Bradford pulled his wool cap down over his ears and tried to focus on the arithmetic problems I'd written on the slate board. The Hendricks twins, Sarah and Samuel, shared a threadbare coat between them, taking turns wearing it during recess, a sight that never failed to break my heart just a little more each day. Behind them sat the older students, James Murphy, whose father worked the railroad, and Catherine Mills, whose mother took in laundry to make ends meet. The classroom smelled of wet wool, wood smoke, and that particular scent of children who had walked through fresh snow, a mixture of cold air and young bodies that had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. I counted heads automatically, a habit born from the fear that someone might not have made it through another night in this unforgiving place. But what I didn't realize then was that my count would never quite add up, that there was something fundamentally wrong with the arithmetic of my classroom that morning. The idea came to me suddenly, like a whisper carried on the wind that rattled our windows. I had been teaching in Anchorage for 2 years, watching these children grow and change, seeing some leave when their families moved south or disappeared into the wilderness, never to return. A photograph, I thought. Something to remember this particular group by. Something to send back east to show the people in Boston what frontier education looked like. My camera was a simple box camera that my father had given me before I left Massachusetts, telling me to document my grand adventure in the last frontier. The children perked up when I mentioned the photograph, their tired faces suddenly animated by the novelty of it all. Most of them had never been photographed before, and the excitement rippled through the room like warmth from our struggling stove. I arranged them carefully, the younger ones in front, the older ones standing behind, making sure everyone was visible and properly positioned. The anticipation in their eyes was infectious, and for a moment, the harsh reality of our isolated existence seemed to fade away, replaced by something that felt almost like joy. Setting up the camera took longer than I expected, my fingers clumsy with the cold as I adjusted the tripod and prepared the film plate. The children giggled and whispered among themselves, their usual classroom discipline relaxed in the face of this unexpected break from our routine. Outside, the wind had picked up again, howling around the corners of our small building like some wild animal trying to claw its way inside. But inside our walls, we had created a pocket of warmth and human connection. I checked the light coming through our frost-covered windows, worried that it might not be sufficient for a clear image. But the white world outside seemed to provide its own illumination, bouncing light back into our humble classroom. The children straightened their postures, smoothed down their hair, and tried to look their very best for what they understood to be an important moment. I took my time, wanting to get everything perfect, wanting to capture not just their faces, but something of their spirit, their resilience, their quiet dignity in the face of such a harsh existence. Little did I know that I was about to capture something else entirely, something that would puzzle scholars and historians for generations to come. The moment felt suspended in time as I prepared to take the photograph. The children perfectly, Still, their faces turned toward my camera with a mixture of solemnity and barely contained excitement. The classroom was quieter than I had ever heard it, with only the crackling of the fire and the distant moaning of the wind to break the silence that had settled over us like a blanket. I could see my breath in the cold air as I bent over the camera, making final adjustments, aware that I had only one chance to get this right, that film was precious and expensive in our isolated corner of the world. The children's eyes followed my every movement, trusting me to preserve this moment, to create something lasting from what felt like such a fragile and temporary gathering. Their faces were so familiar to me by then. Every freckle, every scar from playground accidents, every expression that spoke of the unique challenges and small triumphs of growing up in the Alaskan wilderness. I thought I knew each of them as well as I knew myself, thought I could close my eyes and recall every detail of their young faces with perfect clarity. The camera clicked, capturing what I believed to be a simple class photograph, a routine documentation of my students on a cold February morning in 1911. But as I would learn decades later, some moments in time carry more weight than we can possibly imagine, and some photographs reveal truths that were never meant to be seen. Years would pass before I understood the true significance of that February morning, before I realized that what I had captured was not just a moment in time, but a window into something far more mysterious and profound. The photograph would be filed away with my other teaching materials, forgotten in the immediate struggle of daily survival in frontier Alaska, buried beneath the accumulated weight of subsequent winters and the endless cycle of new students who would come and go through my classroom door. I continued teaching, watching other children grow and learn, witnessing the gradual transformation of Anchorage from a rough railroad camp into something resembling a real town. But that particular morning would remain locked away in my memory, like a secret I didn't yet know I was keeping. The camera was packed away, the film developed by a traveling photographer who visited our town that spring, and the resulting image joined the dozens of other photographs that documented my life. As a frontier teacher, I had no way of knowing that historians would one day scrutinize that simple class photograph with the intensity of archaeologists examining ancient artifacts, that they would discover something that would challenge everything we thought we knew about record-keeping, memory, and the mysterious ways that people could slip through the cracks of official documentation. The winter classroom held its secrets close that day, and it would be many years before those secrets would finally demand to be heard. But when that day finally came, when scholars and researchers began asking questions I had never thought to ask, I would realize that some mysteries are worth waiting a lifetime to solve. The click of the shutter seemed to echo longer than it should have in that small room, as if the sound itself was reluctant to let go of the moment it had just captured. I stood behind the camera for several seconds after taking the photograph, studying the faces of my students as they began to relax from their posed positions, their expressions shifting from formal stillness back to the animated curiosity of childhood. The younger ones immediately began chattering about when they might see the developed photograph, while the older students maintained a dignified silence that spoke of their understanding that this was somehow a significant moment in their young lives. Outside, the wind had died down to a whisper, and the sudden quiet felt almost ominous after hours of constant howling, as if nature itself was holding its breath to see what we had accomplished. I carefully removed the exposed plate from the camera, wrapping it in the soft cloth I kept for such purposes, my fingers gentle with the precious cargo that held our captured moment. The children watched my every movement with fascination, most of them having never seen the mysterious process of photography up close, their eyes wide with wonder at the idea that their images could be trapped forever on a piece of glass. Little did I know that this simple piece of glass would one day become the center of a mystery that would baffle experts and challenge everything we thought we knew about documentation and memory. But in that moment, all I felt was satisfaction at having preserved what I believed was just another day in the life of my frontier classroom. As I packed away the camera equipment, the children returned to their lessons with an energy I hadn't seen in weeks. The excitement of the photograph seeming to lift their spirits despite the brutal cold that pressed against our windows like an unwelcome visitor. Mary Kowalski kept glancing toward the spot where the camera had been, as if she could still see herself reflected in its lens, while Tommy Bradford peppered me with questions about how long it would take for the photograph to be ready and whether we would be able to keep copies for ourselves. The Hendricks twins whispered excitedly between themselves, probably imagining how their parents would react to seeing them in an actual photograph, a luxury that few families in our isolated community could afford. I found myself studying their faces more carefully than usual that afternoon, trying to memorize the details that I hoped the camera had captured. The way Sarah's hair caught the light from the window, the serious expression that Samuel wore when he was concentrating, the gap-toothed smile that lit up Mary's entire face. The older students seemed more subdued but no less affected by the morning's events, and I noticed James Murphy straightening his posture whenever he thought I might be looking at him, as if he wanted to maintain the dignity he had shown for the photograph. Catherine Mills had borrowed a ribbon from one of the younger girls to tie back her hair, and she kept touching it self-consciously throughout the afternoon, clearly pleased with how she had looked when the photograph was taken. It was remarkable how a single moment of documentation had transformed the entire atmosphere of our classroom, bringing out a pride and self-awareness in my students that I had rarely seen before. The traveling photographer, Mr. Augustus Webb, arrived in Anchorage 3 weeks later, his wagon loaded with the mysterious chemicals and equipment necessary to develop the photographic plates that had been accumulating in our small community throughout the long winter. He was a thin, weathered man with kind eyes and hands that moved with the practiced precision of someone who had spent years working with delicate materials, and he set up his makeshift darkroom in the back of Patterson's General Store, the only building in town with sufficient space and darkness for his work. I brought him my plate along with several others I had taken throughout the winter, my heart racing with anticipation as I watched him handle each one with the reverence of someone who understood their precious nature. The children had been asking about the photograph every day since it was taken, their excitement undiminished by the passage of time, and I had promised them that we would view the results together as soon as Mr. Webb completed his work. The development process took 2 days, during which the entire town seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what moments had been successfully captured and preserved from the harsh reality of our daily lives. Mr. Webb worked with quiet concentration, emerging from his improvised darkroom only to purchase supplies or grab a quick meal, his clothes smelling of the sharp chemicals that transformed exposed plates into lasting images. When he finally called for me to come and see the results, my hands were trembling with excitement and nervousness, unsure of what I would find but hoping desperately that the photograph of my students had turned out well. The moment I saw the developed photograph, I felt a surge of joy and satisfaction that warmed me more than our classroom stove ever could. There they were, my students, captured in perfect clarity against the backdrop of our humble schoolroom, their faces bright with youth and possibility, despite the hardships that surrounded their daily lives. Every detail was exactly as I had hoped it would be. Mary's eager smile, Tommy's serious expression, the way the Hendricks twins leaned slightly toward each other in unconscious solidarity, the dignified postures of the older students who understood the importance of the moment being preserved. The light from our frost-covered windows had provided just enough illumination to create a soft, almost ethereal quality to the image, and the contrast between the children's warm humanity and the harsh winter world visible through the glass behind them told a story more powerful than any words could convey. Mr. Webb smiled at my obvious delight, clearly pleased with his work, and he carefully made several copies of the photograph using a process that seemed almost magical to my untrained eyes. I paid him with coins I had saved from my modest teacher's salary, knowing that this expense would mean going without some small luxuries for the next few months, but feeling that the cost was insignificant compared to the treasure I was receiving. As I held those precious copies in my hands, I felt as though I had successfully captured something essential about this place and these children, something that would endure long after the winter had passed and the students had moved on to other chapters of their lives. Little did I know that hidden within that seemingly perfect image was a detail that would one day challenge everything I thought I understood about that February morning. I returned to the schoolhouse the next day with the photographs carefully wrapped in brown paper, my heart full of anticipation as I imagined my students' reactions to seeing themselves preserved in such vivid detail. The children gathered around my desk like moths drawn to a flame, their eyes wide with excitement and wonder as I slowly unwrapped the precious images. savoring the moment of revelation that I knew would be burned into their memories forever. The gasps of delight and amazement that filled the room when they first saw the photograph made every penny I had spent feel like the best investment I had ever made, and I watched with deep satisfaction as they pointed out details and marveled at how clearly their faces had been captured. Mary immediately began planning how she would show the photograph to her parents, while Tommy studied his own image with the intense concentration of someone seeing himself from the outside for the very first time, clearly fascinated by this new perspective on his own appearance. The older students were more reserved in their reactions, but I could see the pride and pleasure in their eyes as they examined the photograph, probably imagining how impressed their families would be to see them looking so dignified and grown up in such a formal portrait. I made copies for several of the families, knowing that these images would become treasured family heirlooms, passed down through generations as evidence of ancestors who had lived and learned in the harsh beauty of frontier Alaska. The photograph was filed away with my other teaching materials at the end of that school year, joining the accumulating documentation of my life as an educator in one of America's most remote territories. But as I placed it carefully between the pages of my record book, I had no way of knowing that this simple image would one day become the subject of intense scholarly scrutiny, or that researchers would discover something in that photograph that had somehow escaped my notice entirely. Years passed, and the photograph became just one of many memories from my teaching days, filed away in trunks and boxes as I moved from one position to another, always carrying with me the accumulated artifacts of my career in education. I eventually left Alaska and returned to the more civilized comforts of the eastern United States, but I never forgot the harsh beauty of that frontier life or the remarkable children who had shared those difficult winters with me in our small schoolhouse. The photograph traveled with me through several moves, always carefully preserved but rarely examined, becoming part of the background documentation of a life lived in service to learning and human development. Occasionally, I would come across it while sorting through old papers, and I would pause to remember the faces of my students and wonder what had become of their lives, whether they had stayed in Alaska to build families and careers or had followed their own paths to other parts of the world. The memory of that February morning remained vivid in my mind. The excitement of the children, the careful preparation of the camera, the satisfaction of capturing what I thought was a perfect moment, in time, preserved forever against the backdrop of that harsh but beautiful winter landscape. I had no idea that decades later, when historians began studying frontier education and examining photographs from remote schools like mine, they would discover something that I had completely missed, something that would transform my simple class photograph into one of the most puzzling mysteries in the archives of American frontier history. The photograph waited patiently in my files, holding its secrets close, until the day when trained eyes would finally notice what I had been blind to for so many years. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in 1964, 53 years after I had taken that photograph, delivered to my small apartment in Boston by a postman who had no idea he was carrying the key to a mystery that would consume the remaining years of my life. Dr. Margaret Thornfield from the Alaska Historical Society had written to me in her careful academic script, explaining that they were compiling a comprehensive archive of frontier education materials and had discovered my photograph in a collection donated by the Patterson family, descendants of the general store owners who had provided space for Mr. Webb's makeshift darkroom all those decades ago. She wanted to know if I could provide any additional information about the children in the photograph, particularly their names and any records I might have kept from my teaching days in Anchorage during the winter of 1911. I felt a thrill of unexpected pleasure at the thought that my simple class photograph had been deemed worthy of historical preservation, and I immediately began searching through my boxes of old teaching materials, eager to help with their research and to revisit those memories of my frontier teaching days. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled out my old gradebook, the leather binding cracked with age but the pages still clearly legible, filled with the names and progress notes of children who had long since grown old or passed away. I could still remember most of their faces clearly, despite the passage of so many years, and I began preparing a detailed response to Dr. Thornfield's inquiry, looking forward to sharing my memories of those remarkable children and that harsh but beautiful winter we had shared together. Little did I know that my response would trigger a chain of investigations that would puzzle researchers for decades to come, revealing a mystery that had been hiding in plain sight for over half a century. I spent the better part of a week carefully transcribing the information from my gradebook, matching each name with my memories of the children in the photograph, and providing as much biographical information as I could recall about their families and circumstances. Mary Kowalski, daughter of a railroad worker, always eager to please and quick with arithmetic. Tommy Bradford, whose father had disappeared into the wilderness one winter and never returned, leaving the boy serious beyond his years. Sarah and Samuel Hendricks, the twins who shared everything and whose mother worked as a seamstress to support them after their father died in a mining accident. I could picture each face clearly as I wrote, remembering not just their appearances but their personalities, their struggles, their small triumphs in the face of the enormous challenges that frontier life presented to children and adults alike. The older students were equally vivid in my memory. James Murphy with his quiet intelligence and dreams of working on the railroad like his father, Catherine Mills, who helped her mother with the laundry business and showed promise as a scholar, despite having to miss school frequently to help with family responsibilities. I included details about their academic progress, their family circumstances, even small personal observations that I thought might be of interest to historians studying the social conditions of frontier Alaska in the early 20th century. My letter to Dr. Thornfield grew to several pages, as I found myself caught up in the pleasure of remembering those children and that remarkable period of my life, when teaching meant not just education, but survival, when every day brought new challenges and small victories that seemed more meaningful than anything I had experienced in my later, more comfortable teaching positions. I sealed the letter with satisfaction, pleased to have contributed something useful to the historical record and looking forward to learning more about what the researchers were discovering about frontier education in Alaska. Dr. Thornfield's response arrived more quickly than I had expected, and the tone was markedly different from her initial inquiry, carrying an undercurrent of puzzlement and urgency that immediately caught my attention. She thanked me profusely for the detailed information I had provided, but then went on to explain that her research team had encountered what she delicately termed some discrepancies between my records and the photograph itself, discrepancies that they hoped I might be able to help them resolve. According to her letter, when they had carefully examined the photograph using modern magnification techniques and compared it with the names and descriptions I had provided, they had identified what appeared to be an additional child in the image, a young person who did not correspond to any of the names in my gradebook or any of the descriptions I had included in my response. She described this mysterious figure as appearing to be approximately 8 or 9 years old, positioned in the second row between Tommy Bradford and the Hendricks twins, with distinctive features that should have made him or her easily memorable, yet this child seemed to have left no trace in any of the official records they had been able to locate. Dr. Thornfield's letter included a magnified section of the photograph that focused on this particular area, and she asked if I could examine it carefully and let her know if it triggered any additional memories that might help solve what was becoming an increasingly perplexing puzzle. The photograph section she had sent showed the area in question with startling clarity, revealing details that had been invisible to the naked eye when I had first received the developed image from Mr. Webb over 50 years earlier. As I studied the magnified image, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Boston winter outside my apartment, because staring back at me was a face that seemed both familiar and completely foreign. A child who should have been as clear in my memory as all the others, but who had somehow vanished from my recollection as completely as if he or she had never existed at all. I spent hours staring at that magnified section of the photograph, my old eyes straining to make sense of what I was seeing, my mind racing through every possible explanation for this apparent oversight in my record-keeping. The child in question was clearly visible, positioned naturally among the other students, with no sign of having been added to the photograph through any kind of manipulation or double exposure, appearing as solid and real as any of the other children whose names and faces I remembered with perfect clarity. The clothing was appropriate for the time period and the harsh Alaskan climate. A thick wool coat, knitted mittens hanging from a string, a cap pulled down over the ears in the same style worn by several of the other children. But despite these familiar details, I could not for the life of me recall ever seeing this particular child before. I examined my gradebook again with obsessive thoroughness, checking and rechecking every entry, looking for any name that I might have missed or forgotten, any student who might have joined the class late in the winter or left early. But the records were complete and matched perfectly with my memories of all the other children in the photograph. The mystery child appeared to be of similar age and social class as the others, clearly comfortable in the classroom setting and positioned among them as if he or she belonged there completely. Yet there was no documentation whatsoever of this person's existence in my files or in my supposedly reliable memory. Sleep became elusive as I wrestled with this puzzle, lying awake night after night trying to force my aged mind to recall some detail that might explain this impossible presence, some memory that had somehow been buried or forgotten over the decades since that winter morning in 1911. The face in the photograph began to haunt me, staring back at me with an expression that seemed almost accusatory, as if asking why I had forgotten something so important, why I had allowed this existence to slip through the cracks of documentation and memory. My second letter to Dr. Thornfield was much shorter and far less confident than my first, filled with apologies and confusion as I admitted that I had no explanation for the discrepancy she had discovered. I described my efforts to match the mysterious child with my records and memories, confessed my complete inability to account for this apparent oversight, and suggested that perhaps there had been some kind of error in the photographic process, or that the child might have been visiting the classroom on the day the photograph was taken without being officially enrolled in the school. Even as I wrote these explanations, they sounded weak and unconvincing to my own ears, desperate attempts to rationalize something that seemed to defy rational explanation. But I had no better theories to offer and no additional information that might help solve the puzzle. Dr. Thornfield's next letter arrived within a week, and it brought news that only deepened the mystery while confirming that my confusion was entirely justified and not the result of failing memory or incomplete record-keeping. On my part, her research team had expanded their investigation beyond my personal records, examining birth certificates, census data, immigration records, and every other form of documentation they could locate from Anchorage and the surrounding areas for the years 1900 to 1915, looking for any trace of a child who might correspond to the figure in the photograph. Their search had been exhaustive and professionally thorough, utilizing resources and techniques that had not been available when I was teaching. Yet despite their best efforts, they had found absolutely nothing. No birth record, no family registration, no mention in any official document of a child matching the description of the mysterious figure in my classroom photograph. It was as if this person had existed only for the brief moment captured by my camera, appearing in that single image like a ghost, that had somehow materialized just long enough to be photographed before vanishing back into the void from which it had emerged. The implications of Dr. Thornfield's findings sent my mind reeling into territories that I had never explored before, forcing me to question not only my own memory, but the very nature of documentation and historical record-keeping. In frontier communities where survival often took precedence over bureaucratic thoroughness, could it be possible that some children in our remote community had lived and died without leaving any official trace of their existence, falling through the cracks of a system that was already stretched to its limits by the harsh realities of frontier life? I remembered how chaotic those winter months could be, with families arriving and departing without notice, children sometimes staying with neighbors or relatives when their parents traveled to other settlements or disappeared into the wilderness in search of work or fortune. The fluid and often desperate nature of survival that made rigid record-keeping seem like a luxury we could ill afford. Yet even accounting for these irregularities, it seemed impossible that a child who had been present in my classroom long enough to be included in a carefully posed photograph could have left no trace whatsoever in my memory or in any official record, as if he or she had existed in some parallel dimension that intersected with our world only for that single captured moment. Dr. Thornfield's letter included copies of additional photographs from the same time period that had been discovered in various archives, and her team was examining each one with the same magnification techniques, looking for any other appearances of the mysterious child that might provide additional clues about his or her identity or origins. The search was expanding beyond Anchorage to other frontier communities throughout Alaska, involving historians and researchers from multiple institutions who were fascinated by what was becoming known in academic circles as the Phantom Student case, a mystery that challenged conventional understanding of photographic documentation and historical record-keeping. As I sat in my Boston apartment, surrounded by the accumulated papers and memories of a long life in education, I realized that the simple class photograph I had taken on that cold February morning in 1911 had become something far more significant than a routine documentation of frontier schooling. It had become a window into mysteries that might never be solved, questions about identity and existence that would outlive all of us who had been present on that long-ago winter day. The breakthrough in Dr. Thornfield's research came from an unexpected source, the private journals of Captain William Bear Morrison, a legendary figure in early Alaskan rescue operations whose handwritten records had been gathering dust in a Seattle archive for 40 years before a graduate student stumbled upon them while researching maritime disasters. Captain Morrison had been responsible for coordinating search and rescue efforts throughout the Anchorage region from 1909 to 1915, using dog sleds, snowshoes, and an intimate knowledge of the wilderness to locate lost travelers, missing miners, and families who had simply vanished into the vast white expanse that could swallow human beings as easily as it swallowed their footprints. His journals contained detailed accounts of dozens of rescue missions, complete with descriptions of the people he had found, or failed to find, and the circumstances that had led to their predicament, written in the matter-of-fact style of a man who dealt with life and death on a daily basis and had no time for sentimentality or elaborate prose. Dr. Thornfield discovered Morrison's journals through a chain of academic connections that stretched from Alaska to Washington state. And when she began reading his entries for the winter of 1910-1911, she found references that made her pulse quicken, with the possibility that she might finally have discovered a clue to the identity of the Phantom Student. Morrison had written extensively about a series of particularly challenging rescues that winter, including several involving children who had been separated from their families during blizzards or whose parents had died in mining accidents or other frontier tragedies, leaving them to fend for themselves in a landscape that showed no mercy to the unprepared. One entry, dated January 15, 1911, described the discovery of a family of 4 who had been missing for 6 days after their cabin was destroyed in an avalanche. But Morrison noted that when he found the survivors, they insisted that there should have been 5 people in their party, a child whose existence they could remember, but whose details seemed to slip away from them like snow melting in the palm of their hand. The entry troubled Morrison enough that he returned to it several times in subsequent journal entries, noting the strange unanimity of the survivors' confusion and their shared inability to describe the missing child beyond a vague sense that someone important had been lost in the white wilderness. Morrison's rescue operations during that brutal winter read like a catalog of human suffering and miraculous survival, each entry documenting another family torn apart by the merciless climate and the constant dangers that lurked in every shadow of the Alaskan wilderness. He wrote about finding 3 children huddled in an abandoned mine shaft, their parents frozen to death in a cabin less than a mile away. The children surviving for 8 days on nothing but melted snow and a few crackers they had hoarded from their family's meager supplies. Another entry described discovering a young mother who had walked 17 miles through a blizzard while carrying her infant son, following what she swore was the sound of a child calling for help through the storm, though Morrison found no trace of any other person in the area where she claimed to have heard the voice. The pattern that emerged from Morrison's careful documentation was disturbing in its consistency. Rescue after rescue where survivors reported the presence of children who could not be accounted for, whose descriptions shifted and blurred even as the witnesses struggled to hold on to memories that seemed to evaporate like breath in the frigid air. Morrison began to suspect that the extreme conditions and psychological trauma of survival in the wilderness were causing some kind of collective hallucination or false memory syndrome. But his scientific skepticism was challenged by the remarkable specificity of many of these accounts and the fact that they came from people who had never met each other and had no opportunity to coordinate their stories. He started documenting these anomalies more carefully, creating a separate section in his journal devoted to what he privately called ghost children, cases where survivors insisted they had been traveling with or caring for children who seemed to exist only in their memories and nowhere else in the physical world. The winter of 1910-1911 produced more of these cases than any other period in Morrison's 6 years of rescue work, leading him to wonder if there was something particular about that season that had triggered this phenomenon. Some combination of factors that had created conditions where the line between reality and desperate hope had become dangerously blurred. The most detailed and disturbing entry in Morrison's journal was dated February 3, 1911, just 5 days before. I had taken my class photograph, and it described a rescue mission that had haunted the captain for months afterward, one that he returned to repeatedly in his writings as he tried to make sense of what he had experienced. A family named the Kowalskis, and my heart stopped when I read that name, recognizing it immediately as Mary's family, had sent word to town that they were missing their 8-year-old nephew, who had been staying with them while his parents worked a claim further north, and who had disappeared during a particularly severe blizzard that had kept everyone trapped indoors for 3 days. Morrison and his rescue team had searched for the child for over a week, following tracks that seemed to appear and disappear in the snow like miracles and illusions, finding evidence of a small person moving through the wilderness, but never managing to catch up with the elusive figure who seemed always to be just beyond their reach. What made the case so disturbing was that when Morrison finally returned to question the Kowalski family more thoroughly about the missing child, he discovered that none of them could provide consistent details about the boy's name, appearance, or even how long he had been staying with them, their memories fragmenting and contradicting each other every time he asked for clarification. Mary's father, whom I remembered as a straightforward and reliable man, became visibly agitated when pressed for details about his nephew, claiming that he could picture the boy's face clearly in his mind, but finding himself unable to describe it in words, as if the image would dissolve the moment he tried to speak it aloud. Mary's mother broke down in tears during the questioning, insisting that she had fed the child breakfast every morning for weeks, but unable to remember what he liked to eat or how he had come to be in their care, her distress so genuine and profound that Morrison began to doubt his own sanity rather than question her truthfulness. The search was eventually called off when no trace of the child could be found despite exhaustive efforts, but Morrison noted that the family continued to set an extra place at their dinner table for months afterward, as if expecting the mysterious nephew to return from wherever he had gone. Their grief for this phantom child as real and devastating as if they had lost a flesh-and-blood relative. As Dr. Thornfield read through Morrison's journals, she began to see connections between his rescue operations and the mystery of my classroom, photograph that sent chills down her spine and challenged everything she thought she knew about historical documentation and human memory. The timing was particularly significant. Morrison's most puzzling cases involving phantom children had occurred throughout the winter of 1910-1911, culminating in the disappearance of the Kowalski nephew just days before I had arranged my students for their photograph, creating a pattern that suggested something more than mere coincidence was at work. She noticed that several of the families mentioned in Morrison's rescue reports had children enrolled in my school, creating connections between the documented cases of missing or phantom children and the students who had been present when I captured that moment in time with my camera. The geographic distribution of Morrison's cases formed a rough circle around Anchorage, with the schoolhouse near the center, as if some kind of phenomenon was radiating outward from our small community and affecting families throughout the region in ways that defied rational explanation. Dr. Thornfield began mapping Morrison's cases alongside census records, school enrollment documents, and birth certificates, looking for patterns that might explain why so many people in our area had experienced similar episodes of confusion and false memory regarding children who seemed to exist only in their recollections and nowhere else in the official record. Her research team expanded to include psychologists, anthropologists, and specialists in folklore and mass hysteria, all trying to understand how an entire community could develop shared delusions about phantom children who left no trace of their existence beyond the blurred and fragmented memories of people who swore they had known them intimately. The investigation was taking on the characteristics of a detective story, with Morrison's journals providing crucial evidence about a phenomenon that had affected our entire region during that harsh winter, creating conditions where the line between reality and desperate hope had become so blurred that even trained rescuers and experienced frontier families could no longer trust their own memories or distinguish between the children they had actually known and the ones they had only imagined in their dreams and nightmares. Morrison's final entry about the phantom children was dated March 20th, 1911, as the worst of the winter was finally beginning to break, and the first signs of spring were appearing in the endless expanse of snow and ice that had held our region in its grip for 6 brutal months. He wrote about a strange sense of relief that seemed to settle over the entire community as the weather improved, as if some invisible burden had been lifted from everyone who had survived that particular winter. But he also noted that the memories of the phantom children began to fade even more rapidly once the immediate threat of survival had passed. Families who had been grief-stricken over missing children they could not describe began to question their own recollections, wondering if the stress and isolation of the winter had caused them to imagine threats and losses that had never actually occurred. Their relief at survival mixing with confusion about what had been real and what had been the product of minds pushed to their breaking point by extreme conditions. Morrison himself began to doubt the accuracy of his own journal entries, wondering if his careful documentation of these cases had been influenced by his own exhaustion and the psychological pressure of conducting rescue operations under impossibly difficult circumstances. But he decided to preserve the records exactly as he had written them, believing that future researchers might be able to make sense of patterns that were invisible to him in the immediate aftermath of the events. His last entry on the subject was both poignant and disturbing, expressing his hope that no other community would ever experience the particular combination of factors that had created such widespread confusion and false memory during that winter in Anchorage, while acknowledging that he would never understand what had really happened, or why so many people had shared such similar delusions about children who seemed to exist only in the spaces between reality and desperate hope. Dr. Thornfield's team found Morrison's journals to be the missing piece of the puzzle they had been searching for, providing context and documentation that transformed my simple class photograph from an isolated mystery into part of a larger pattern of unexplained phenomena that had affected our entire community during one of the harshest winters in Alaskan history. The phantom student in my photograph was no longer an isolated anomaly, but part of a documented wave of phantom children who had appeared in the memories and experiences of dozens of families throughout the region, creating a mystery that would challenge researchers for generations to come and force them to question everything they thought they knew about memory, documentation, and the strange ways that extreme conditions can blur the line between what is real and what is desperately wished for. Dr. Thornfield's investigation took an unexpected turn in the autumn of 1965 when she received a cryptic telephone call from Father Gabriel Mackenzie, an elderly Catholic priest who had served remote Alaskan communities for over 50 years before retiring to a small monastery in Oregon. Father Mackenzie had read about her research in an obscure academic journal and claimed to possess information that might shed light on the phantom children phenomenon. But he insisted on meeting in person rather than discussing the matter over the telephone, his voice carrying an urgency that suggested he was revealing secrets he had kept buried for decades. When Dr. Thornfield traveled to Oregon to meet with him, she found a man whose weathered face and penetrating eyes spoke of a lifetime spent ministering to people living on the very edge of survival. Someone who had witnessed more human suffering and inexplicable events than most people could imagine in their darkest nightmares. Father Mackenzie led her to his sparse cell in the monastery, where he had assembled a collection of documents and artifacts that he had been secretly preserving for over 50 years, waiting for someone with the proper academic credentials and intellectual curiosity to help him make sense of what he had experienced during his years in the Alaskan wilderness. His hands shook slightly as he opened a wooden box that contained what he described as his unofficial records, documents that he had never shared with his superiors in the church hierarchy, because he feared they would either dismiss his observations as the fantasies of an isolated mind or, worse, interpret them as evidence of supernatural phenomena that might bring unwanted attention to his remote parish. The contents of the box would prove to be more disturbing and illuminating than anything Dr. Thornfield had discovered in Morrison's rescue journals, providing a spiritual and psychological dimension to the phantom children mystery that challenged conventional understanding of memory, reality, and the human capacity for collective delusion. But what Father Mackenzie revealed that afternoon would also force Dr. Thornfield to confront the possibility that some mysteries are too dangerous to solve completely, that there are truths hidden in the frozen wilderness that are better left buried beneath the accumulated snow of decades and the merciful amnesia of time. Father Mackenzie's unofficial records began with his arrival in Alaska in 1908, when he had been assigned to minister to the scattered communities and mining camps that dotted the territory like tiny islands of human civilization, surrounded by an ocean of wilderness that seemed determined to reclaim every foothold that humanity had managed to establish. His early entries were routine accounts of baptisms, marriages, funerals, and the daily struggles of people trying to build lives in a place that tested human endurance in ways that the comfortable parishes of the lower 48 could never imagine. But by the winter of 1910-1911, his tone had begun to change as he encountered phenomena that challenged everything he had been taught about the nature of reality and the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. He wrote about families who came to him seeking comfort for children who had died, but whose bodies could never be found. Parents who mourned with genuine grief for sons and daughters whose names they could remember clearly, but whose faces seemed to slip away from them like water running through their fingers every time they tried to recall specific details. Father Mackenzie had initially attributed these cases to the psychological trauma that frontier life inflicted on families, particularly during the brutal winter months when isolation and desperation could drive even the strongest minds to create elaborate fantasies as a defense against unbearable reality. But as the cases multiplied throughout that winter, he began to suspect that something more complex and disturbing was occurring in his scattered parish. His training had taught him to distinguish between genuine spiritual experiences and the products of overwrought imagination, but the phantom children cases defied such easy categorization, presenting him with grieving parents whose pain was absolutely real even though the objects of their grief seemed to exist only in their memories and nowhere else in the physical world. He began conducting what he privately called memory interviews with affected families, carefully documenting their recollections and looking for patterns that might explain how so many people could develop such similar delusions about children, who left no trace of their existence beyond the anguished testimonies of those who insisted they had known and loved them. The results of these interviews filled dozens of pages in Father Mackenzie's careful handwriting, creating a record of collective trauma and false memory that provided crucial context for understanding the broader phenomenon that had affected our entire region during that harsh winter. The most significant discovery in Father Mackenzie's archives was a series of letters he had exchanged with other clergymen throughout Alaska and Western Canada, correspondence that revealed the phantom children phenomenon had extended far beyond the Anchorage region to affect isolated communities across thousands of square miles of wilderness territory. Father Thomas O'Brien in Fairbanks had written about similar cases among his parishioners, describing families who insisted they were missing children who had never officially existed, their grief so profound and their memories so detailed that he had begun to question his own understanding of death, memory, and the nature of human consciousness under extreme stress. Father Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, a French missionary working among the indigenous communities along the Yukon River, had documented what he called les enfants fantômes, phantom children who appeared in the dreams and waking visions of entire families, creating shared hallucinations that were so vivid and consistent that tribal elders began to speak of them as visits from the spirits of children who had died in previous generations and were returning to comfort the living during particularly harsh winters. The correspondence revealed a network of isolated clergymen who had independently encountered the same phenomena and had begun sharing their observations in letters that were never intended for official church records, creating an informal archive of unexplained events that challenged everything they had been taught about the relationship between faith, reality, and human psychology. Father Mackenzie's letters to his colleagues were filled with theological questions that had no easy answers. If these phantom children existed only in the minds of those who mourned them, why did their grief seem so genuine and their memories so detailed? If the children were products of mass hallucination or collective trauma, why did the hallucinations follow such consistent patterns across such vast distances and among people who had no contact with each other? The clergymen struggled with these questions throughout that winter and for years afterward, some eventually dismissing the entire phenomenon as the product of extreme conditions and overwrought nerves, while others began to develop theories about the spiritual significance of shared visions and the possibility that human consciousness could create realities that existed independently of physical evidence. Father Mackenzie had preserved every letter in this remarkable correspondence, creating a unique archive that documented how religious leaders had grappled with phenomena that challenged both their theological training and their understanding of human psychology, forcing them to confront mysteries that had no precedent in their experience or their sacred texts. The most disturbing document in Father Mackenzie's collection was a detailed report he had prepared in the spring of 1911, intended for his bishop, but never sent, describing what he had witnessed during a visit to the Kowalski family just 2 weeks after Morrison's failed search for their phantom nephew, and only days after I had taken my class photograph. Father Mackenzie had gone to their cabin to offer comfort and spiritual guidance to a family that was clearly suffering from some kind of profound loss. But what he found there challenged everything he thought he understood about grief, memory, and the human capacity for self-deception in the face of unbearable tragedy. The family had set up a small shrine in their main room, complete with candles, flowers that had been preserved in the cold, and a photograph that showed empty space where they insisted their missing nephew should have been standing, their certainty about his presence so absolute that they could point to the exact spot in the image where they claimed to see him smiling back at them. Father Mackenzie had stared at the photograph for nearly an hour, looking for any trace of the child the family described, but he could see nothing except empty space and the blurred background of their cabin interior. Yet the Kowalskis continued to speak to the photograph as if it contained the image of a beloved family member who was simply temporarily absent from their physical presence. Young Mary Kowalski, whom I knew as one of my brightest students, had been particularly affected by her phantom cousin's disappearance, spending hours each day talking to the empty space in the photograph and setting aside portions of her meals. For a child who existed only in her family's shared delusion, her behavior so convincing that Father Mackenzie found himself occasionally glancing toward the spot where she claimed to see her missing relative. The priest's training told him that he was witnessing a family in the grip of a collective psychological breakdown, probably triggered by the extreme stress and isolation of frontier life. But his pastoral instincts recognized genuine grief and love in their interactions with the phantom child, emotions so real and profound that he began to question whether the absence of physical evidence necessarily meant that their loss was any less valid or their pain any less deserving of comfort and understanding. His unsent report concluded with a paragraph that revealed the depth of his confusion and the challenge that these cases presented to his faith. He wrote that he had come to the Kowalski cabin prepared to offer consolation for what he assumed was an imaginary loss. But he had left wondering whether his understanding of reality was too narrow to encompass the full range of human experience, and whether there might be forms of existence and relationship that transcended the physical evidence that his rational mind demanded as proof of truth. Father Mackenzie's most troubling revelation came near the end of his meeting with Dr. Thornfield, when he pulled out a final document that he had never shown to anyone and had been debating whether to destroy for over 50 years. A personal journal entry that described his own encounter with what he believed might have been one of the phantom children during a late-night walk through Anchorage in March of 1911. He had been returning to his quarters after administering last rites to a dying miner when he noticed a small figure walking ahead of him in the snow. A child who seemed oddly out of place on the deserted street at such a late hour and in such bitter cold, moving with a purposefulness that suggested familiarity with the terrain despite appearing to be no more than 8 or 9 years old. Father Mackenzie had called out to the child, concerned about finding someone so young alone in such dangerous conditions, but the figure had not responded or even acknowledged his presence, continuing to walk steadily through the snow until it reached the schoolhouse where I taught, at which point it had simply vanished, as if it had never existed at all, leaving no footprints in the fresh snow and no evidence of its passage except Father Mackenzie's own confused and shaken memory. The priest had searched the area thoroughly, looking for any sign of where the child might have gone, any door or window that might explain such a sudden disappearance, but he had found nothing except his own footprints in the snow and the growing certainty that he had witnessed something that defied rational explanation, something that challenged his understanding of the natural world and forced him to confront the possibility that his years in the wilderness had finally pushed his mind beyond the boundaries of reliable perception. His journal entry described the profound spiritual crisis that this experience had triggered, forcing him to question whether his encounter had been a vision, a hallucination, or something else entirely, a glimpse into a realm of existence that, existed parallel to the physical world, but followed different rules and left different traces in human memory and experience. Father Mackenzie told Dr. Thornfield that he had never reported this incident to anyone, fearing that it would be dismissed as the fantasy of an overwrought mind or interpreted as evidence of spiritual experiences that his superiors might not understand or approve. But the discovery of her research had convinced him that his silence had been a disservice to the families who had suffered through similar encounters with phantom children during that terrible winter. As he handed her his private journal, Father Mackenzie's eyes filled with tears, and he admitted that he had spent 54 years wondering whether his encounter at the schoolhouse had been real or imagined, whether the child he had seen walking through the snow had been one of the phantom children that had haunted so many families that winter, and whether his failure to follow up on the incident had somehow contributed to the mystery that continued to baffle researchers and torture the memories of those who had experienced losses that could not be documented or explained through conventional means. The final piece of the puzzle came to me in a dream on the night before my 87th birthday. A vision so vivid and detailed that I woke with tears streaming down my face and a certainty that had eluded me for over half a century of wondering and questioning. In the dream, I was back in that one-room schoolhouse on that February morning in 1911. But this time I could see everything with a clarity that my younger eyes had somehow missed, as if the passage of time had finally granted me the perspective necessary to understand what had been hidden in plain sight all those years ago. The mysterious child was there, sitting quietly between Tommy Bradford and the Hendricks twins, but now I could see the truth that my conscious mind had been protecting me from. This was not a phantom or a product of mass hallucination, but a real child whose presence in my classroom had been so brief and so tragic that my mind had chosen to forget rather than carry the weight of what had happened next. His name was David, and he had been brought to my school by his grandfather, old Pete Kowalski, Mary's great-uncle, who had found the boy half frozen and delirious after his parents had died in a cabin fire somewhere deep in the wilderness. The child's memories of his past life scattered and fragmentary like pieces of a shattered mirror that could never be made whole again. I remembered now how old Pete had begged me to let David attend classes for just a few days while he figured out what to do with an orphaned child who had no official existence in any record book, no birth certificate or family documentation that might help authorities place him with relatives or find him a proper home in the territorial system that was already overwhelmed with cases of abandoned and orphaned children. David had been silent throughout his brief time in my classroom, traumatized by whatever he had witnessed in the wilderness and unable or unwilling to speak about his past. But his eyes had held an intelligence and sadness that made all of us treat him with special gentleness, as if we recognized that he was carrying burdens too heavy for such young shoulders. The dream showed me details that my waking mind had somehow suppressed. The way David had shared his lunch with the younger children, the careful attention he paid to every lesson even though he never spoke or raised his hand, the small smile that would cross his face when Mary or one of the other students included him in their games during recess, moments of connection that had pierced through his traumatic silence and reminded us all that beneath the damage and confusion, there was still a child who deserved love and protection. The terrible truth that my dream revealed was why David had vanished from our lives and our memories so completely, why old Pete had never mentioned him again after that February morning, and why the entire community had somehow conspired in forgetting that such a child had ever existed among us. 3 days after I took the photograph, David had wandered away from old Pete's cabin during a blizzard, drawn by some sound or sight that no one else could perceive, walking out into the white wilderness with the same purposeful determination that Father Mackenzie had witnessed during his late-night encounter near the schoolhouse. Old Pete had searched frantically for hours before the storm became too dangerous, and by morning, when the wind finally died down enough to organize a proper search party, there was no trace of the boy except for footprints that led directly toward the river and then vanished at the ice edge, as if he had simply walked into the frozen water and disappeared beneath its surface without a struggle or a cry for help. Captain Morrison had been called in to coordinate the search effort, but even his legendary tracking skills could find no evidence of what had happened to David, no body to recover or clues to explain how a traumatized child had managed to navigate through a blizzard and vanish so completely that not even the most experienced wilderness guides could determine his fate. The official report listed David as a casualty of exposure, another victim of the harsh Alaskan winter that claimed so many lives during those brutal frontier years. But Morrison had noted privately that something about the case troubled him, in ways he could not articulate, a sense that the child's disappearance was connected to larger patterns that he was only beginning to recognize but could not yet understand. Old Pete had been devastated by the loss, blaming himself for failing to protect a child who had already suffered so much trauma and loss. And in his grief, he had made a decision that would affect everyone who had known David during his brief time in our community. He asked each of us to promise that we would never speak the boy's name again, never discuss his time among us, never do anything that might keep the memory of his suffering alive in a world that had already caused him too much pain. It was a strange form of mercy, born from the frontier understanding that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for the dead is to let them rest in peace rather than tormenting their memory with endless questions and investigations. But it had the unintended effect of creating a conspiracy of silence that gradually erased David from our conscious memories, even as his presence continued to haunt our dreams and our peripheral vision. The community's collective agreement to forget David had been reinforced by the psychological defense mechanisms that frontier families developed to cope with frequent loss and tragedy. A learned ability to compartmentalize grief and move forward without being paralyzed by the accumulated weight of everyone they had loved and lost to the wilderness. We had all seen too many children die from disease, accidents, exposure, and the countless dangers that lurked in every shadow of frontier life, and we had learned that survival sometimes required a deliberate forgetting, a conscious decision, to focus on the living rather than being consumed by mourning for the dead, no matter how much we had loved them, or how deeply their absence wounded our hearts. David's case had been particularly difficult because his time among us had been so brief and his official existence so tenuous that it became easier to let him slip away from our memories than to carry the weight of another senseless tragedy, another reminder of how quickly and randomly the wilderness could claim the lives of those we had grown to care about. The photograph had captured his image, but our minds had gradually edited him out of our recollections, protecting us from the pain of remembering a child whose life had been so damaged and whose death had been so meaningless that acknowledging his existence felt like admitting our own powerlessness in the face of forces too large and cruel for human understanding. Old Pete had died the following winter, taking with him the last official knowledge of David's brief existence, and the rest of us had gradually allowed our memories of the boy to fade into the background of our consciousness, where they remained, like old scars that ache only when the weather changes, or when something unexpected triggers a flash of recognition that is quickly suppressed and forgotten. The families who had reported phantom children to Captain Morrison and Father Mackenzie had been remembering fragments of David's story, their minds creating false memories of missing relatives as a way of processing grief that they were not supposed to feel for a child they had promised to forget, their psychological defense mechanisms generating elaborate fantasies, rather than allowing them to acknowledge the simple truth that they were mourning a real boy whose death had been too painful for their community to remember. Dr. Thornfield's research had unknowingly reopened wounds that our entire community had spent 50 years trying to heal through deliberate amnesia, forcing us to confront memories that we had buried so deeply that they had begun to seem like dreams or hallucinations, rather than recollections of actual events. When I called her after my revelatory dream and told her what I now remembered about David, she listened in stunned silence as I described the brief time he had spent in our classroom and the tragic circumstances that had led to his disappearance, and our collective decision to forget him rather than carry the burden of another senseless loss. Her response was a mixture of relief at finally having an explanation for the phantom children phenomenon and horror at the realization that her academic investigation had inadvertently violated the privacy of a community's grief, forcing people to remember traumas they had chosen to forget for the sake of their own psychological survival. She told me that her research had identified similar patterns in other frontier communities throughout Alaska and Western Canada, places where harsh conditions and frequent tragedy had created informal protocols for collective forgetting, agreements to erase certain memories rather than allowing them to destroy the mental health of entire populations who were already living at the very edge of psychological endurance. The phantom children phenomenon was not unique to Anchorage, but represented a widespread coping mechanism that frontier communities had developed to deal with losses that were too frequent and too devastating to be processed through normal grieving procedures. A form of cultural amnesia that protected the living at the cost of erasing the dead from official memory and historical record. Dr. Thornfield realized that her academic investigation had stumbled into territory that was better left unexplored, that some mysteries exist specifically because forgetting them is necessary for the psychological health of those who survive, and that the pursuit of historical truth is not always worth the cost of reopening wounds that have been deliberately sealed. She made the difficult decision to publish only a limited version of her findings, acknowledging the existence of the phantom children phenomenon without revealing the specific details that might re-traumatize the families who had worked so hard to forget their losses. Understanding that academic curiosity must sometimes be balanced against human compassion and the right of communities to process their traumas in whatever way allows them to continue functioning in an impossibly difficult world. The knowledge that David had been real, that his presence in my classroom and his image in the photograph were not products of false memory or supernatural phenomena, but evidence of a brief life that had ended in tragedy, brought me a strange mixture of sorrow and peace that I had not expected after so many years of wondering and confusion. I could finally grieve properly for a child whose loss I had been forbidden to acknowledge, whose memory I had been trained to suppress, whose brief existence had been erased from our community's official history as a form of psychological protection that had ultimately caused more confusion and pain than healing. In my final years, I began to remember David more clearly, recalling the quiet dignity with which he had endured his trauma, the gentle way he had interacted with the other children despite his own suffering, the intelligence and sensitivity that had shone through his silence and made all of us instinctively protective of his fragile emotional state. I wrote letters to the surviving members of my former students' families, sharing what I now remembered about David and asking them to help me piece together a more complete picture of his brief time among us, but most of them were reluctant to revisit memories that they had spent decades trying to suppress, understanding that some forms of forgetting are merciful rather than destructive. Mary Kowalski, now an elderly woman herself, was the only one who agreed to meet with me, and she confirmed many of the details that had returned to me in dreams and fragments of recovered memory, admitting that she had never entirely forgotten her phantom cousin but had learned not to speak of him because it upset the adults too much to be reminded of their failure to protect a child who had already suffered so much loss. She told me that she still thought of David sometimes, wondering what kind of man he might have become if he had survived the winter and grown up among people who could have helped him heal from whatever traumas had damaged him so deeply. But she had made her peace with never knowing the answers to those questions, understanding that some stories end in mystery and loss rather than resolution and closure. As I prepared to join David and all the other phantom children who had walked out of our lives and into the white wilderness of memory and forgetting, I found comfort in the knowledge that his brief existence had mattered, that his presence in our classroom had touched lives and created connections that had survived even the deliberate attempt to erase him from our collective consciousness, and that somewhere in the frozen archives of human experience, his silence would finally be broken by the acknowledgement that he had lived, however briefly, and that he had been loved, however inadequately, by people who had done their best to protect him in a world that offered no guarantees of safety or survival to anyone, let alone to damaged children who carried the weight of traumas too heavy for their young souls to bear. The photograph sits in my bedroom now, propped against the lamp on my nightstand, and I can see David clearly whenever I look at it, his face no longer a mystery, but a reminder of the thousands of children who lived and died on the American frontier without leaving traces in the official records that historians use to reconstruct the past. He represents all the phantom children who slip through the cracks of documentation and memory, whose brief existences are erased by poverty, tragedy, and the simple inability of overwhelmed communities to keep track of every life that passes through their temporary embrace before disappearing back into the wilderness from which we all ultimately come and to which we all must eventually return. Dr. Thornfield's research officially concluded that the phantom children phenomenon was a case study in collective trauma response and community coping mechanisms, but I know that the real conclusion is simpler and more profound than any academic analysis can capture. Sometimes we forget because forgetting is the only way to survive. And sometimes we remember because remembering is the only way to honor those we have lost, and the tension between these two necessities creates mysteries that can only be resolved by accepting that human experience is too complex and too painful to be entirely documented or completely understood. David's silence was not just the product of trauma, but a recognition that some truths are too terrible to be spoken aloud, some losses too devastating to be acknowledged, some forms of love too fragile to survive the harsh light of analysis and investigation, and his presence in my photograph serves as a permanent reminder that the most important stories are often the ones that official history overlooks, the ones that survive only in the dreams and peripheral vision of those who loved, the people that the world chose to forget. The winter classroom holds its secrets lightly now, no longer burdened by the weight of deliberate amnesia, but graced by the understanding that forgetting and remembering are both forms of love, both ways of honoring the brief flames of human existence that burn so brightly and so briefly against the vast darkness of wilderness and time, both necessary strategies for surviving in a world where phantom children walk among us, reminding us that reality is more mysterious and more fragile than we dare to admit, and that every photograph captures not just the faces we can see, but the absences we carry, the losses we survive, and the love that persists even when memory fails and official records crumble into dust.